Welcome back to Beyond the Books, LLC's very own podcast. LLC, of course, stands for the School of Literatures, Languages and Cultures at the University of Edinburgh. And this podcast covers every aspect of the research which goes on here. My name is Beth Price. I'm a PhD researcher as well as the host of this podcast. And I get to sit down with one of LLC's fabulous researchers every episode and grill them on their research, their journey in academia and anything else in between. This time, Charlotte Gleghorn is my wonderful guest. She is Senior Lecturer in Latin American Film Studies as well as Director of Research in LLC. Her research focuses on Latin American Indigenous filmmaking, thinking about questions of authorship, community and identity. So Charlotte, thank you so much for joining me.
No problem, Beth. It's great to be here.
So to kick off, in 60 seconds or thereabouts, please can you sum up your research, so what you're working on at the moment and any fun projects that you're doing?
Okay, so that's a bit of a tall order in 60 seconds, but my main area of research is in Latin American cinemas, broadly understood. So different aspects of authorship, production practices, and also questions of representation and memory. And most of my recent research engages more explicitly with Indigenous filmmaking and Afrodescendant filmmaking. Like all umbrella categories, Latin American cinemas is quite a broad placeholder, really, for lots of different practices. But it has historically run in parallel to more community-led forms of film production and media production. So Indigenous filmmaking really are films and media that are led, influenced, sometimes commissioned, authored in different ways by Indigenous persons and communities themselves. Same definitions would apply to Afrodescendant filmmaking also. And these communities have historically been represented in some ways in Latin American cinema, but often their perspectives are not seen as perhaps valuable. There's not been a diversity of perspectives. And this has really changed significantly since about the 80s, 90s.
Why is Indigenous filmmaking seen as separate from Latin American filmmaking as a whole?
So Indigenous filmmaking has often been parceled out from Latin American filmmaking, really principally because with the gaining importance of the self-identification of the director or the screenwriter and the claims for authorship rights in relation to filmmaking, it's very apparent that although Indigenous communities and persons have been represented since the advent of cinema in Latin America since the late 19th century, really been part of its history there in the region, it's only until relatively recently that they've really been able to gain more traction in the industry, if we can call it that. It's often more community practices. There's not necessarily a robust industry in many of the countries. So that has meant that there are films that engage with indigeneity, Indigenous representation, Indigenous languages. There are also very, very problematic works in the history of Latin American cinema by Latin American and other filmmakers from their perspective, and the Indigenous communities and persons have been portrayed as barbaric, savage, primitive, often unable to take on the dynamic aspects of change and Eurocentric or Euro-Western modernity. So that is why there's a claim among the Indigenous filmmaking and media movement really for greater access to film, because there's a real need to present different stories. There's a very solidified narrative around what Indigenous cultures mean in Latin American societies. And Latin American societies have inherited really the colonial hierarchies and racist hierarchies from the earlier centuries. So most nations gained their independence in the 19th century. But for Indigenous communities and Afrodescendant communities, many of the structures of domination have persevered into the independent era. Even in countries where there's more languages acknowledged as official languages, or even in Indigenous languages, as in Paraguay, where Guarani is also a national language, there's a sense that the nation state needs a cohesive identity that is centered on the use and practice of the shared language. So I think language and linguistic discrimination has been a real aspect that is shared by many Indigenous peoples around the world. The discourse of Indigenous purity is still very strong around the world. And there are all sorts of contested and hybrid identities, and in many ways, Indigenous movements, for instance, there's an active negotiation of self-identification in relation to indigeneity and territory, but often that doesn't deny other influences and other family connections. Commonly, Maori, there's a number of Maori filmmakers, artists, writers, thinkers who talk about negotiating that challenge, and they often have mixed ancestry with Scotland. It's quite a diverse kind of scenario globally, I think, Indigenous film production. And in part, that's just Latin American. In the Latin American context, the material constraints are far greater than in Canada, US, Aotearoa, and Australia. I mean, it's just, they're incomparable in terms of film industries.
I've read some of your research on Indigenous identity in film, and you said, and others have said, that filmmaking for particularly Latin American Indigenous directors, producers, writers, etc., it can both be a way of them sort of rebuilding and stating their identity, their cultural identity, but there's also this sort of pressure with it to try and educate the audiences, and it sounds like this idea of formal self-identification might play into that. Can you tell me more about that conflict, where they're trying to set out this identity on film, but also this lingering pressure to have that as this is the identity of this particular Indigenous group?
Yeah, the question of the pedagogical expectation, I think, in relation to indigeneity on film is quite pressing. So in the Latin American context, most Indigenous film production is in the documentary mode. There are increasingly some fiction films coming out, or short films, but most production is in documentary mode. And that also shapes the way audiences understand this prerogative to teach them about something, because documentary has inherited this idea that there's a lesson to be learned in some ways, to instruct, to show, to prove a point. So I think the languages of documentary in a way have changed massively since those early critiques of documentary. There's many different ways, both in documentary practice, but also in criticism, that transformed the way we think about those elements of didacticism, I suppose, in relation to documentary film. But the prejudice, really, that there's a burden of representation on Indigenous persons and communities to instruct settler audiences, broadly understood, it still plays out today. There's an interest among Indigenous communities to really use documentary to perhaps recover certain practices that haven't been performed for some decades. There's a belief in film as a repository of the changing cultural memory, and also in some scenarios, a newer media to help with intergenerational knowledge transfer. But still, among most of the filmmakers I work with, there's not a huge appetite, in fact, to think about fictionalizing stories. It's changing, and partly, again, that has to do with the infrastructural constraints, that there's perhaps not been training. Fiction is generally much more expensive. The circuits of prestige around fiction filmmaking are very different as well, and perhaps more exclusionary for Indigenous people to enter. But yeah, I mean, just recently in one of the research projects I'm involved with, I was interested in trying to work with the subtitling and name the different languages that have been used, because there's a certain element of code switching. And while perhaps for the national audience where the film was being made, it would be evident that they weren't always speaking in Spanish and that was a movement with different Indigenous languages, for an international audience, that wouldn't necessarily be true. I was invested in trying to sort of find different strategies of representing those shifts, but also in a way of honouring and respecting the distinctive languages that are in this work. So it's interesting how those kind of impressions play out in both documentary, but also in fiction film.
How have you found dealing not only with different variants of Spanish, but also the different Indigenous languages?
Before university, I lived and worked in Argentina for about 8 months. So the Spanish I learned at university was always a Latin American variety. I actually did my year abroad in Spain So I learned other elements of the Spanish there. I think in relation to my research more recently, it's an interesting question because there's a greater push nowadays, in part because of the UN Decade for Indigenous Languages, for film production by Indigenous communities to be made in Indigenous languages. But sometimes this is really it's fraught with difficulty because a lot of communities have been dispossessed of their languages intentionally. Their languages have been stolen, and so there's very few speakers. So this also asks questions about the kind of Spanish that they speak and whether that is equally valued or if they're always discriminated against for not speaking proper Spanish. So this comes out in the film production. I think that there's a huge variety in the film festival circuit. There's no real lingua franca. I mean, Spanish or Portuguese in the Latin American context tend to be the languages spoken in the festivals. Many of the filmmakers will only speak one of those languages. So many of them will speak their mother tongue in addition to Spanish or Portuguese. So how these works actually circulate and transcend the Indigenous nation context is quite interesting. So in some ways, I think they kind of scaffold different audiences in their very form. So that's a way of reaching both within their community, but also to the national constituency and then internationally.
My research is historical. I look at cultures, I look at images, I look at film in a Chinese context, but I mostly focus on the 20s, 30s, 40s. So when I'm looking at data or when I'm looking at how things were made, it's from historical records, it's from publication lists, it's from distribution lists, etc. The films that you're working on, the industry that you're looking at, they're being made. They're not a historical thing that's sort of static. How does that affect how you approach investigating them?
It's a great question, but you're absolutely right. There's not kind of a preformed object of study or kind of archive that I can access in relation to this. I do try and historicize the contemporary production by obviously looking at other tropes and forms of production that have informed it, because nothing really exists in a vacuum. So there are kind of different ways of thinking about the genealogies of film production with Indigenous communities, and then also the kinds of practices that are playing out today in the contemporary film production. There's often an engagement, an explicit engagement, in fact, with the archive. So there'll be a resignification of ethnographic film. There'll be a return of films to the community. There'll be embedded in the documentary films themselves. There'll be an audience on screen, which is the community who are watching the older film. And often the relationships are really touching that communities might have with the film, but perhaps by today's lenses and perspectives, we would disregard as being very, very, very problematic. But because there's a connection to ancestors through the film, and they can actually talk about their family connections, the changes in the territory, the cosmological connections also, it can mean a whole range of things to the community to retain a film from the archive. So there is a real trend in a lot of contemporary Indigenous filmmaking to engage with the archive in some way. In terms of researching the actual contemporary practices, I think that's one of the challenges. I'm not an anthropologist, and I haven't had the time in the field to be able to actually witness, a production from start to finish. And I'm not even sure that would really give me a complete vision. There's always going to be contingencies and things that you missed, and it's always going to be shaped by my own positionality in the field in that particular moment. But I did recently work on a project where I saw a little bit of the film shoot. And this was a film that had very strong participation of several Indigenous communities and different levels as script advisors, extras, actors, community authorities, negotiating access actually to the shooting locations. And it was very eye-opening, I think is how I'd probably describe it, to witness a film production. In this particular case, it was a fiction film, arrive in this location with everything that means, and witness and accompany some of the negotiations around shooting in that place. But that's a unique experience for me. I mean, I normally don't have that opportunity. So in terms of access to primary resources, my primary resources, I guess, are not only the films, which I do normally have to go to festivals, Indigenous film festivals, mostly in Latin America to access, but also because I try to complement the works with voices of the director and community members in some cases. I conduct interviews and try and co-author interviews as well in terms of publication. So that's been a shift, I think, in terms of thinking about other ways of knowledge production, I suppose, in terms of more collaborative outputs.
So we've talked a lot about Indigenous cinemas. How does that connect to the project that you've worked on, Creole Connections, which is Afrodescendant cinema and film?
Yeah, Creole Connections, which effectively now is launched as a bilingual media platform, really. That emerged from an AHRC International Network grant that was specifically to celebrate and support initiatives of the UN Decade for Peoples of African Descent. And when we were working on connecting really our different regional specialisms and concentrations in the collaborative team I was talking about before with Julie Couples in geography, geosciences. And she had worked for decades in Central America, and I'd worked for a long time in Colombia, and also with an Afro-Colombian film festival called Carabantu. Well, Carabantu is the organization that organizes the festival. So we were thinking about ways that we could connect the work in terms of visibility, media visibility, invisibility, how to support initiatives that were underway in relation to galvanizing different Afro media professionals from across Colombia in that particular instance, how to connect them with the Central American counterparts. And the question of San Andres and Providencia, so two islands that geographically are much closer to Nicaragua. They're extraordinarily far from the Colombian mainland, but in geopolitical terms belong to Colombia. It's a disputed territory, and Nicaragua and Colombia had a Hague ruling on this in 2012, but that is not the only Hague ruling. And they ruled in Colombia's favor in terms of the actual land mass, the territory, but they did cede a substantial amount of marine territory to Nicaragua. So this has created more tensions, really, not for the communities involved necessarily, but in terms of the policing of their territory. They used to maintain quite strong links. So when I say they, I'm referring to the Rizal Black Creole community. And the Rizal have at different stages identified as an Indigenous people and as an Afro-descendant people. And in that particular area in the Mosquito Coast, so Central America and Caribbean, there's long histories of exchange and trade. The British presence there has really shaped also the surnames and certain practices they share, celebrations, the maypole dance. This emphasis on those shared histories really came through in the networking project. So when there was the opportunity to apply for further funding for something kind of to connect the research we've been doing in relation to ancestral ties, reigniting community connections and visibilizing different Afro-descendant struggles, we felt that was a real priority community for us to work with. Yeah, it was a long journey because we originally got the follow-on funding in 2019, I think, but then of course the pandemic hit and it was extraordinarily difficult to get the filmed resources from the islands to the mainland or to here. And there was a hurricane in the middle as well. So yeah, it's taken many years really to be able to complete that project. But we're really excited about how it's being used now. It's being used by community groups, by different university courses. There's a real appetite for it to be able to support perhaps different educational Rizal initiatives, but also to help them use it in geopolitical terms, really, to advocate for what they need to be able to bring back their trade connections and shared cultural heritage.
It struck me as it's much more an oral history that really preserves the voices of these people from the community. Was that the intention with it, that it was going to become this repository for oral histories?
Yeah, in the web platform design, we always hoped that these videos would really convey the voices of the people we talked to, and also we interviewed people from across different generations, so there's quite distinct views, and from different sites across the Roselle, Black Creole diaspora. So there's interviews from Bluefields and Corn Islands in Nicaragua, from San Andres, from Providence, from Lena, and then also in the mainland in Colombia, in Bogota and Medellin. And that really shapes the different kinds of perspectives on the archipelago and their shared connection and the future of their languages and their cultures, really. We'd hoped that by using filmed oral testimonies, we could really share the materials more broadly, particularly because Creole as a written language is evolving. There's a New Testament that was translated into Creole in San Andres, and that's a huge thing that they're very proud of. And in Nicaragua, they look upon that as a real measure of strength in terms of language preservation. But yeah, we hoped that the media element would transcend some of the national boundaries, which are so difficult for them to navigate. So historically, they would have got on a boat and could have traveled between the communities with relative ease in a few hours. And now it's extraordinarily costly. So we wanted to bring alive those voices, those oral histories, those testimonies, so that communities in different locations could experience their connection again.
How important are oral narratives for preserving these almost snapshots of community, history, identity?
Yeah, I think the potential for cinema and media generally is often seen as a really underexploited resource in terms of capturing the different perspectives, Indigenous, Afro, but also giving them the respect they deserve as distinct languages. Often in the case of Latin American Indigenous media production, for instance, generally speaking, we're talking about works that are potentially in Spanish, sometimes in an Indigenous language, and then they'll be subtitled into Spanish. And then from that, we go into English. And there's been some progress in terms of subtitling in Indigenous languages as a resource also to mitigate against the idea that the cultures are only oral as well, because the younger generations, they have been taught to disregard the value of their languages, and it's really important to try and give them equal footing and equal respect. So that's been an interesting development, I think. Having said that, there is an emphasis on using oral narratives, often origin stories, in a lot of film production these days, because precisely there's a strong tradition of storytelling, and the way stories are often passed is orally. So while that's not an exclusive characteristic, and I certainly wouldn't advocate for Indigenous cultures being seen as exclusively oral and not written, there's opportunities there to share stories in a different format.
And on the idea of a different format, Creole Connections is quite a non-traditional platform for preserving this resource that people can look to from across the world and from within those communities to say, this was the experience of this person, and this is an actual reflection of members of those communities. Those are real reflections. More broadly, do you think there's a shift in academic practice, particularly in a European or a UK setting, towards, I guess, valuing these sort of non-traditional resources more?
Yeah, I think there has been a shift. I think within film studies, there's a shift also in recent anthologies. I've noticed that there's an attempt to incorporate more practitioner voices as well. So I think that there are different kinds of outputs, although that's still in written text anthology form. But more broadly, yes, I believe there has been a shift towards more creative outputs. I'm not entirely convinced yet that they have the same intellectual weight as a form of knowledge production for committees that assess the research outputs of universities. But certainly there's all sorts of examples from across the School of Literatures, Languages and Cultures alone. For instance, translation as a different form of output, as a creative practice, podcasts, but also maps, literary cartographies. I think that there's great potential there. I think the traditional written form of scholarship is very important also. Queer Connections took several years to complete. And in that process, we'd already done some research, which has also now been published. And that really accompanied the process. And there's a lot more that we want to say about the process as well, and reflect upon in relation to publications, but also the actual oral histories, the testimonies. I think that there's materials there for other people to use. So in that sense, it aspires to be kind of an open resource, with attribution and everything, but that could be really open up different avenues of research for other scholars. And that's one of the benefits, I think, of perhaps more creative, public-facing outputs. They're not behind a paywall necessarily in the same way.
Yeah, I thought the paywall thing is probably quite one of the most fundamental bits of it. It is accessible. It is actually something that people can go and look at, not necessarily already being in an institution. You can go and look at the website, whether you're enrolled at a university or not. It isn't protected knowledge almost. And just moving away from your current research, or I suppose the research projects that you've led recently, can you tell me a bit more about your academic journey to this point? How did you come to be a senior lecturer here at the University of Edinburgh?
I was very fortunate, really, and I think I had a good dose of luck, really, on my career path so far. So I was always really, really passionate about cinema and different sorts of cinematic cultures. And so my undergraduate was in French and Spanish, actually, at University of Leeds, and they had a master's program in world cinemas, which I very quickly knew that I wanted to take after finishing my undergraduate. So I did the master's program and then wanted to explore more doctoral study. So I continued really on the questions of Latin American cinema. So my master's thesis was on Colombian cinemas and violence. My PhD thesis was on women's filmmaking and post-dictatorship in Argentina and Brazil. So again, very, very centered on the questions of authorship and authority and how power and representation is negotiated by different sectors of the national constituencies that I was looking at. And I got a PhD scholarship from the HRC. I studied at University of Liverpool, and then I was fortunate to get a postdoc, which is quite rare in the arts and humanities, but yeah, on an ERC, a European Research Council Advanced Grant at Royal Holloway. And in some ways, that was a bit of a step change for me. That was really when my research career started looking in greater depth at Indigenous cinemas and media practices. And in Royal Holloway, I was part of this big international interdisciplinary team looking at different aspects of Indigenous performance. So that project was really exciting. It was quite ambitious. We worked on an exhibition that was held in London in 2013. So that project, Indigeneity in the Contemporary World, really introduced me to the world of transnational connections between the Indigenous movements in different countries, and gave me the opportunity to work with some amazing colleagues and artists. And that was coming to an end anyway when the University of Edinburgh advertised a round of Chancellor's fellowships. So I applied and was offered the position here. I've been here since 2013, and I am extremely fortunate in that I've had to move around. I've moved from Leeds to Liverpool to London to Edinburgh, but I haven't had to undertake the kind of fixed-term contracts that are very common today in the academic precariat.
How does it impact your research planning to have gone PhD to relatively short-term postdoc to then Chancellor's Fellow? And I know that you've received a couple of other grants since you've been at Edinburgh. So is it a case of you're always thinking about the next project in the back of your mind as well as the thing you're working on, or is it a bit more flexible than that?
To a degree, I think I am always thinking at the back of my mind, and I think it's very common among academics and researchers to always have a kind of side project or something that you would like to devote more time to that's kind of bubbling in the background while you're working on something. I have been quite active in looking for research funding. Principally, that is because when you're in the kind of nuts and bolts of a teaching semester, as much as I love teaching, it's very, very difficult to turn your mind to the writing component. And so I've been working for a very long time actually on a book that I'm hoping to complete in the next few months. That has really motivated me to apply for different aspects of funding. So there was the HRC Leadership Fellowship in 2018, and then more recently the British Academy Mid-Career Fellowship. And that, I think, is partly connected to the book's genesis, its ambition. There's a big comparative study of Indigenous filmmaking and authorship practices, but also the contribution of people who I have collaborated with and how that has changed my thinking. So when you're doing something over such a long period, it's kind of inevitable that it becomes kind of quite difficult to put a full stop to it. I think it's part of the process, and I think that grant funding really enables you to, if you can be fortunate enough to be awarded some funding for dedicated time on a project, then that really helps you to kind of distill your ideas in written form. There are other projects that have been more motivated by collaborative teams. I have a good working relationship with colleagues in other schools in the university, principally Professor Julie Couples in geosciences. So that has also helped kind of always keep an eye on different elements of funding that are coming out, different calls, and as a team really to kind of keep things ticking along while you're also trying to advance your own kind of publications and research.
This has been so fascinating, and I think we could keep going, but I will wrap up. Do you have any closing advice for students in LLC or students more broadly, or anyone who's interested in filmmaking research in Latin American film and Latin American Indigenous film, etc.?
I think, as I said before, I've been immensely lucky. I'm very grateful to a lot of the opportunities that I've been able to make the most of. I think the challenges of continuing research remotely, particularly if you work in somewhere that's a long way away, that can be difficult, I think, in terms of positionality, in terms of legitimacy, and in terms of really sensing and feeling the changes on the ground. I would say in terms of developing that kind of research, it's important to think about how you will maintain relationships at a distance. And that's something that I think that we all have to struggle with in some degree if we're located in a university in the global north and do research with communities elsewhere. It's something that we should engage with, certainly with communities here also, but the actual practical limitations of those aspects are a bit different. In terms of support for developing careers in academia here in Edinburgh, in the UK, as students, postgraduate students, I think it's really important to develop support networks, like engage with your peers, engage with your friends who are also doing PhDs or master's programs or developing work. And that's really supportive because sometimes it can be really insular. And I think it's important to think about those kind of connections and synergies across different areas as well. And sometimes there's quite unexpected elements that you'll discover, and that's a real blessing. And that helps also focus on the enthusiasm and your passion for the subject, because ultimately you have to work and research on something that you really love or that you feel commitment to. And I think unless you find that, it's going to be an uphill struggle. And so I would say, develop support networks and then really try and celebrate the things that you love most about your research.
Thank you so much for sitting down and talking to me. It's been such a fascinating discussion. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for the questions. They're really insightful.
Thank you for listening. This has been another episode of Beyond the Books with me, your host, Beth Price. Thank you again to Charlotte Gleghorn for sitting down with me for today's episode. If you enjoyed this episode and you want to hear more from me, you can find the rest of this series via Apple Podcasts, or you can head to YouTube at the University of Edinburgh LLC to find all of the episodes there. Or if you really like, you can head to the university website to find not only this series, but my predecessors' series, Emma Aviette and Ellen Davis Walker. Head to llc.ed.ac.uk/research/beyond-the-books. In the meantime, I have been Beth Price. This has been Beyond the Books. Thank you so much for listening.